Welcome, listener, to the Eve of Terror. I, the Doctor, have excavated this grisly episode, and I must warn you, if you be listening to this podcast, turn back, lest ye be cursed. Or, don't. I'm sure it'll be fine. I mean, no one believes in that sort of thing, do they? They've released Mother! Back in your cage, Mother! It's not the equinox yet! No!
Welcome everyone, and welcome back to the show. And this week we have something a little bit special in that it's that time of year again, my favourite holiday, and it is the Halloween special. Today, I'm going to be introducing you to a friend of mine who's doing a really interesting project in narrative horror storytelling. So please welcome to the show, my friend, Sound Matt.
Hello there. How you doing, Paul?
I'm doing all right, mate. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
It is our pleasure, and I'm sure will be. Do you want to introduce our lovely listeners to yourself and what you're doing with the new project?
Sure, Paul. Hi, lovely audience. I'm Matt Dempsey, and I'm a sound designer, which, for those that don't know, is someone that creates new sounds for films and games and mixes them together. When lockdown happened earlier this year, I finally had time for a creative project of my own that I've been very excited to get started. It's called The Stygian Chronicles, and is a horror anthology podcast series in the vein of Tales of the Crypt or The Twilight Zone.
So it sounds really fascinating, and I mean, I've known you on the technical side. Just to give listeners a background, we've worked on some films together, and you've done the sound for a couple of podcasts I've been involved in, different podcasts that I've been involved in over the years, and we've been connected for a long time. But what I didn't really know about you was that you were kind of really into this genre, and I think given that this is a Halloween special, it's kind of a perfect opportunity for us to kind of look back through the history of horror, and we can tie it into, the ancients and the archaeology where we want to, and kind of play around with that a bit.
That sounds like fun.
Cool. So what's your take on the history of horror? I mean, where does it start for you?
The history of horror for me starts right at the beginning of human history. For as long as there's been fire and darkness and people sat together in a community, there have always been fables and ghost stories, all those kinds of tales that not only teach and instruct, but also thrill and entertain. As you look through history, you get things like Gilgamesh, which is the oldest found written story. Ancient civilizations start talking about gods and pantheons, and you can really see the identity of different cultures as the gods act very differently from each other. You take Egyptian gods, for example. A lot of it's about balance. You have Ra fighting against Apophis, the cycle of day and night every day. You have Osiris weighing a human heart against a feather to see if they're worthy of the afterlife. Compare that to the Greek pantheon, which is very liberal and has Zeus coming to earth and having his way with anything that can walk. It's a very different set of ideals. Stories are really important to us in a way that goes a lot deeper than many people realise. It starts with humanity trying to make sense of the world around it, trying to give rhyme and reason to the natural world, like why do the storms come, why does the river flood, all those kinds of things. And we start to try and find our own importance in the world and go, well, here we are, making something that no other animal does. We're writing books and plays and music along with agriculture and imperial expansion. So clearly we are favoured amongst the gods and get this idea that we are something that is special and important. We use stories as a tool for exploring ideas and disseminating information. We tell stories to our children so that they know how to be good and not to go baiting animals or walk off with strangers, how to take care of themselves and not be foolish, a tradition we maintain to this day.
Very true. And they've kind of become a way of not only reinforcing, and this is what you see through history, kind of reinforcing the cultural values that they're spawned from, but taking it back just to pull out a thread that you mentioned right at the beginning is the idea of stories being there since there was a fire. I mean, for me, that's the first kind of binary opposition of light and dark. That's the first time you get humanity seeing the shadows and that kind of liminal space between the edge of the campfire and the rest of the night where all the noises are coming from. And to me, that's really interesting because what you've pulled up for me is the idea that every culture has this version, as you rightly say, of this kind of light versus dark, good versus evil, the sun versus night. Even in Egypt, it went through several iterations, and absolutely, as you say, it starts with Ra fighting Apophis, Apep, the serpent, and it kind of ends with later Egyptian civilization with this myth taking on the form of Horus versus Set. But then every other culture pretty much has a version of this. All of the major cultures of the world have a version of this, all the way up to St. George and the Dragon. slaying the serpent, slaying the monster, slaying the other, the darkness. And so it's kind of these social, cultural, reinforcing these ideas of who we are, but also, exactly like you say, this kind of learning mechanism for humans. What stands out for you in kind of those historical ways, in the way that we have developed narrative then?
Well, do you know what? There is something I would like to chuck in there beforehand,
Sure.
which is about looking in the dark. Our ancestors being at the fire and having that hazy area, and then the black, the unknown. But more importantly, what you were saying about knowing where the sounds come from. Our ancient ancestors listening at night, hearing crickets and wolves and hyenas, all these little skittering things in the darkness. Because we as a race are diurnal and therefore so focused on sight being our primary sense, the terror of the unknown that sets in with the dark and what's in there and what's causing those noises and what can tempt you. And if you go out there, you probably won't come back.
Yeah.
That primal fear that comes when you lose your primary sense and not being able to defend yourself. That was a big reason that I made this project audio only. The concept of using just sound and letting your mind fill in the gaps to add in the horror and suspense is definitely something we wanted to explore with this project.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes a great deal of sense when you frame it in that way, of the loss of the primary sense as well. So looking at the development of narrative in that way, how do we see these monsters becoming embodied in story, in mythology and things like that?
It starts off as an oral tradition, but as we move later through history, people start to write stories down. The Grimm brothers are a prime example, writing down their fairy tales of Germany, because up to that point, they only existed in the oral tradition. They weren't formally written down anywhere. It was just what mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers told their children and grandchildren, and that's how it was passed on. The Grimms realised that so much of this rich cultural history could be so easily lost, as so much in history has been lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we as archaeologists always come back to, the notion of ancient texts not being something that tend to survive very well unless they're in a desert, which is why we're so lucky with the Egyptian material and papyrus. So kind of moving on from those ideas and this kind of folklorish idea of the story, I know that there's quite a lot of links, and we've looked at this on the show to some degree in the past, and I'm hoping to get into it a bit more today, with the links between kind of early Egyptology and early colonial practices and the development of the Gothic horror. And I was kind of hoping we could get into that a little bit, really, and talk about some of those authors and some of their influences.
The first story that can be called Gothic is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole in 1764. The second edition was printed with A Gothic Story as a subtitle. It sets up the romantic Gothic traditions that excellent writers like Mary Shelley, H. Rider Haggard, Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker used to such great effect in their works.
So coming off the back of this we get the birth of an entire genre, really, which seems to start pretty early with writers like Mary Shelley.
Oh, yes. I have a wonderful story about Frankenstein if you'd like to hear it.
Okay.
So, Frankenstein was published in 1818. 3 years before that, in 1815, there was a massive volcanic eruption. Mount Tambora erupts. The following year is called the Year Without a Summer, as the pollutants that came out of the eruption covered the world and led to darkness and plenty of rain.
That's fascinating.
Yes, it's horrendous. And here we have Mary and Percy Shelley, together with Lord Byron in London, sat at home looking around at the fearful weather ruining their summer, and decide enough is enough, let's go somewhere that there will be some sunshine. So they pack their bags and travel across to Geneva, thinking that the air will be pure and the water will be clear, and they can get away from England. The story is they take 10 men to get all their stuff over there, not realising this is a global catastrophic event. And when they get to Geneva, they find that it's the same as England. Dark, cold, miserable and wet. So, trapped inside, the first thing they think of, they start telling each other ghost stories. But eventually, they run out of ghost stories.
Right.
But being writers, they know what they can do, write some new ghost stories. And so Mary Shelley starts to write Frankenstein.
Right, I see. So it's kind of born out of these, well, almost environmental circumstances rather than... I always thought it was just a writer's competition. I didn't realise the geographical context behind it, so to speak. That's really interesting.
That's why Frankenstein is set in a mountainous region, and why the weather is so horrible, and why it had such a dark atmosphere and tone.
Yeah.
Because Mary Shelley was in such a dark and gloomy place.
That's really interesting, and it's kind of a sign of the cultural memory as well that gets preserved in all these different ways. I mean, we think of fiction now. Just a weird kind of offshoot example of this, actually, is I have been replaying the Tomb Raider series, and I'm going to be interviewing Janelle Elliott soon, who was the actor, Lara Croft actor for Tomb Raider 4 and Angel of Darkness. And the thing that struck me about those games was that they replicate this kind of dark sky full of, quickly moving smoke or cloud to show the ominous presence that's been released during that series. And casting back, I can think of examples of that from, everything back through Bram Stoker's Dracula, through the Hammer horror examples of the works of people like Edgar Allan Poe, and probably even back as far as Rider Haggard.
Think of the first line of every good ghost story. It was a dark and stormy night.
Absolutely, yeah. I was literally about to say the exact same words. Yeah, those are so ingrained, aren't they?
I think it comes back to not being able to see, because in the night and the dark, you can kind of see things, and your eyes can play tricks on you. It's that primal fear coming through, trying to explore the dark, and to explore the unknown, and I think it's why the imagery persists as a trope within horror.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So moving forward through time, what shapes Gothic horror the most, in your opinion?
Frankenstein, without a doubt. I mean, to me, Frankenstein has to be the archetype. It forges a path not just in horror, but is also regarded as the first science fiction book ever.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful book that encompasses themes such as the arrogance of man, the corruption of innocence, father against son. There are all these different themes that run through it, and they're seamlessly interwoven. You can read that book 5 times and still come away with a different perspective. But Frankenstein aside, I think Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1903, is also such an influential work, because it's told in a unique way, which creates a ticking clock which evokes a feeling of suspense very effectively. It's told by way of correspondence between the protagonists. So, Count Dracula is trying to get over from Transylvania, the old world at the time, to England at the height of the British Empire, and he has a lot of resources at his disposal to achieve this. The people that stand against him are apart from each other. They can only talk to each other through letters, which take a really long time to get to their destination, and then takes time for the reply to come back.
Yeah.
Every second that they're trying to figure out what's happening, Dracula is getting closer.
Yeah.
Compare that to Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which has a set of characters that start to notice odd things happening in their town as a stranger moves in that no one ever sees.
Right.
Initially, they rationalise it because they live in a modern world that's forgotten the old stories and doesn't believe in them anymore. As the characters start to figure out what's happening and convince people of the truth and try to stop it, the vampire is getting more powerful as the curse spreads through the town. And so it's a race against time before the vampire controls the whole town, and it's too late, which gives this ever-deepening suspense over the course of the book.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
It's clear that Dracula was very influential on Salem's Lot, and I think every vampire story from when it was published to the modern day.
And that's an interesting thing as well, because it reflects something that was going on at the time, which is this tension, if you will, between the kind of new school of rationalism, or the increasingly powerful school of thought of rationalism, which is conceiving of itself as separate and different from the older, quote-unquote, superstitious ways that became associated with the cultural other. So you see this a lot in tales about ancient Egypt and mummies, for example. I mean, do you look at any of those things at all in your work?
Bram Stoker went on to write the Jewel of Seven Stars, which is based in Egypt with mummies.
Yeah, the Jewel of Seven Stars is a good one, actually, and it's one of my favourites, probably because it touches on so many of the other themes that are set out in the mummy literature leading up to it. A lot of the themes that you see in the mummy stuff, mummy stories, for instance, don't, and Egyptian stories in general, start out kind of as romances rather than horrors, and they only really join into that genre a little bit later. And I think it was Louisa Alcott who wrote Little Women, weirdly, who was the first person to use the mummy's curse as a structural kind of basis for a story. And of course, mummy's curses became really prolific after the King Tut stuff. But before all of that happened, you've got, and I always find the tension, the dichotomy of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really interesting, because here's a man who wrote the most famous rationalist character in the world, Sherlock Holmes. This is a character who has no time for nonsense, doesn't believe in the supernatural, and his modus operandi is often to defeat the supernatural by showing it to be what it is, which is trickery.
Oh, what's the famous line? Remove the impossible, and whatever is left, however improbable, must be the truth.
That's the line. That's the line. And so we've got that kind of in contrast to the man himself, who also wrote, and you're probably very familiar with these, 2 stories called The Ring of Thoth, which seems to have been extraordinarily influential, as was Lot number 249, which I mean, lot number 249 is about a student who's purchased a mummy at an auction and restores it to life by, reading ancient formulas on papyrus and burning special leaves. And this is almost the exact plot of the later Hammer mummy movies.
And you were talking about H. Rider Haggard. His book, She, does exactly the same thing with this concept of resurrection and asks the question of, what did these ancient peoples know? When artifacts were being found in Egypt and the troves of treasures of an ancient civilization that hadn't been found anywhere else, at least not at that time. Because, as you mentioned, the desert conditions are so good at preserving things, so the shifting sands are constantly hiding and revealing things.
Very true.
And the Egyptians built stuff to last, The pyramids have been standing for how many thousands of years now?
4.5, nearly 5,000 years, yeah.
Yeah, could you imagine any of our current constructions lasting that long?
No, not really. This is true.
So yes, the question that pops up in people's imagination, what did the ancients know? Did they know as much as us? Did they know more than us? What did they discover that we haven't? And if they do know things that we don't, could they apply that knowledge to harm us? I mean, we're separated from the Egyptians by oceans of time, yet the threats of the mummy's curse, that even beyond the grave, 4,000 or 5,000 years down the line, they can still get you.
Yeah, that's the thing. And the whole idea of a curse, this whole thing took on a lot of steam around the time of King Tut's excavation and discovery. And the notion of why that happened, or the story behind why that happened in itself, is quite interesting, because Howard Carter was sponsored by Lord Carnarvon, Earl Carnarvon, and he was the subject of one of the first automobile accidents.
Really?
He was one of the first car owners in the country, and he was the first one to crash it. He wraps his car around a tree or something like that, and his doctor says, well, you need to convalesce. And what do gentlemen do when they convalesce back in the day? They go to Egypt.
Nice warm weather, plenty of sunshine.
Exactly, plenty of sunshine, get some fresh air, and see what all of these lovely archaeologists are up to. So he's out in Egypt, and he decides, I want to get in on this excavation game, and he starts asking around. And Howard Carter, who had worked in Egypt for some time, he was, very long story short, originally an artist, and Carnarvon was looking for someone who was practically skilled, but not too involved that he would be expensive and difficult to work with. And he came across Carter, who kind of fit the bill very well. And Carter was kind of, he ended up in Egypt because he was from a modest background and he was a good artist. And I think it was one of the lords or ladies at the time that was involved in an excavation said, send me someone, but not a gentleman. Meaning, don't send me someone with a lot of demands. And so Howard Carter gets sent out there. And as they say, the rest is history. But the idea of the curse, in addition to already having been to a degree part of this kind of folklore of disturbing the ancient and part of this taboo of disturbing the grave and disturbing the dead and entering these quote-unquote liminal spaces, there's kind of a more practical reason for the reason that curse story ends up snowballing the way it did culturally, and that's because Carnarvon was friends with the director of the Times, who, at the time, he decided to give exclusive access to all of the news that was coming out about the excavation. And this ruffled a lot of feathers, obviously, both in Egypt and at home. And so the papers had to try and either outscoop the Times to get what information they could, or...
Not an easy thing to do.
Not an easy thing to do, exactly. Or they could start capitalizing on these other stories they were hearing locally. And
oh no, not sensationalism.
Exactly, sensationalism. And there's talk that it was actually a rival archaeologist, someone Carter had helped actually displace from their job, who ended up kind of helping lead and whip up the curse fury as a journalist at the time. So it's a former Egyptologist who had been a bit embittered by his own personal experience with Carter. I think the story goes that Carter had dobbed this other Egyptologist in for skimming artifacts or trying to smuggle artifacts or something like that. And so, yeah, so there's this whole kind of weird series of events. But anyway, sorry, I've gone way off topic there.
Not at all. That is an amazing story and linked to the history of horror. When people think media panics, people tend to think of the video nasties of the 1980s.
Yes.
Moral campaigns were started and newspapers sensationalised the story.
Yeah.
It's easy to think that there was something that was just of its time. Oh no, they were doing this 100 years ago.
Yeah, 100%.
Not even that, 60 years ago.
Yeah, this has been happening for a long time, and it ties into this idea of the story, exactly like you say. I mean, if we don't have access to the story we want, do we just inevitably make up one to fill the space, I guess? It kind of comes down to that.
Just as an aside, you were talking about Arthur Conan Doyle earlier. When Earl Carnarvon died, Conan Doyle latched onto the story and said that he thought Carnarvon's death had been caused by elementals created by Tutankhamun's priests to guard the royal tomb.
Yes.
Which, doesn't help.
No, it doesn't help at all. Yeah, I'd actually forgotten that detail, that Conan Doyle decided to weigh in with his kind of spiritualist opinion. It seems so funny to me that he did that. But at the same time, I think in his first story, he's kind of feeding off, getting back to the literature, he's feeding off of Rider Haggard, as you rightly say, has these ideas of resurrection and reincarnation, which is interesting because that's not an Egyptian concept. We don't find reincarnation in ancient Egypt.
Get your heart weighed by Osiris, and then if you're worthy, you move on to paradise, and if you're not worthy, then you get eaten by a giant crocodile.
Yes, exactly. So we've got Conan Doyle's in the mix. Lot 249 has come along and changed, certainly, mummy stories. And I know from having a look at the literature surrounding kind of the mummy stuff and the curse stuff that a lot of the stories of this period seem to be reflecting kind of colonial, post-colonial anxieties around emergent feminism, stuff like that. I mean, is there anything in that area that you're seeing as Gothic horror is developing, like in those themes?
Absolutely. You were saying earlier about the other, the concept of they that aren't us are the other, and the other is to be feared. Let's start with the fact that other cultures are alien by default.
Yeah.
We are each raised in our own individual cultures that have a way of seeing the world and sets of beliefs and behaviours that are unique.
Yeah.
The wonderful thing these days is that we can share those stories and get a global perspective and come to understand each other. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, however, the English were the number one global superpower and they were subjugating countries around the world. So the thinking was, what was there to be afraid of? We own the world. But then uprisings for independence caused unrest throughout the world, and this empire starts crumbling. People start to get very scared of the loss of this perceived superiority, and this vulnerability makes people scared at the possibility of retribution as these people that were horribly mistreated are no longer under the yoke.
Exactly, yeah.
While this was happening abroad, back at home, women were starting to come to a point where they were absolutely sick and tired of being treated like second-class citizens in their own homes, and wanted to stand equal with their husbands and sons, and started to create movements to get themselves these rights.
Yeah.
So the fragile ego of the colonial male was now being completely threatened, their way of life completely taken apart. No longer were they superior, now they were equal with everyone else, and the loss of that power was an incredible shock to their system.
I mean, the Jewel of Seven Stars is actually a really good example of that, because you've got the original ending, the basic plot, spoilers for a 100-year-old story. In the original plot, it's Queen Terra, who is an Egyptian queen who's been excavated, who happens to resemble the archaeologist's daughter. So there's that whole weird kind of slightly incestuous necrophile oddness going on in the Hammer film as well. The Hammer film was called Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, by the way. They renamed it to make it a bit more appealing and fit it into the kind of context of all the mummy movies that they've done before. But yeah, in that story, the original ending has the evil spirit of the mummy, Queen Terra. She permanently possesses this nice kind of genteel Victorian daughter of this archaeologist, and it ends just horribly for everyone involved. And that gets rewritten the year of his death. So
Rewritten? But that ruins the end with the lights being turned on and revealing everyone dead, which ties back to a flashback earlier in the book where Terra's tomb is found with dead bodies inside, and we as readers can make the correlation between the two and realise what's happened with the possession and get the chills up the spine. What do they do?
I suppose what they do is they try and make it more comfortable for all of these anxious readers who don't want to see this other, this ancient female power from the Orient prevail over the white Western hero, so to speak.
Oh, they give a happy ending. Yeah. Everyone lives.
It does undo the kind of tragedy of it all a bit, doesn't it? I seem to remember, and I'd be interested actually to get your take on the work of Lovecraft, because he starts dipping into this area as well, doesn't he?
Yes, I think I know where you're going here. 1920, Nyarlathotep.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Lovecraft is an interesting case. Lovecraft is credited as the creator of the concept of cosmic horror, but where that came from comes back to this idea that we use stories to explore our environment and our history and ourselves.
Yeah.
The historical context here is that he's writing during the First World War with a scale of violence and destruction never seen before, and millions of people killed without a second thought. It breeds a different perspective on the world.
Yeah.
Rather than our early days when we were the chosen of the gods or the romantic exoticism of the Gothic period, Lovecraft instead starts to think, what if we got it all wrong? What if in the scale of the universe we are no more than ants? And what if this driving force of so-called progress is actually a bad thing for us? A very conservative and nihilistic viewpoint.
Yeah.
And with Nyarlathotep, he demonstrates his fear of the other while exploring humanity's insignificance. I've got the book open because I wanted to quote the language that he uses. Into the land of civilizations came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister. Those are the words that he chooses to use to describe his antagonist. He implies immediately that Nyarlathotep has come from a savage place because he's moved into the lands of civilization. And in there you can see his immediate distrust with non-white cultures with those 3 words. Swarthy, slender, and sinister.
Yeah. I mean, swarthy itself, that's a word to unpack.
Oh God, do we have the time?
No.
Yes, it's such provocative language. By the end of the story, this alien other has caused significant harm to the protagonists. It starts with a group coming to see a show performed by this man from Egypt with old blood and the look of a pharaoh. And they see this show, which has a reputation for being frightening and showing things that no man has ever seen. The protagonist goes in and sees the show and afterwards tries to explain and rationalise. But the curtain has been pulled back and now he sees at things that live in the shadows. And it says here, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep.
Yeah.
He explores the terrifying idea that there may be gods, but what makes you think they think about us at all, or that they're on our side?
Yeah.
And so we've come from the ancient pantheons and being the chosen of the gods, to post-colonial exoticism and fear of the other who's out to get you, to cosmic horror where we as a species are nothing and the outright nihilism resulting from the destruction that a world war brings.
Yeah, and that's a really valuable point, kind of taking it back into context, because a lot of the time we look at these stories in a bubble almost, without thinking about the stuff that's going on in the world, which is, I guess, the point of a lot of this exercise. Certainly for me as an archaeologist and Egyptologist, when I look back at these kinds of stories. I haven't read an awful lot of Lovecraft, really. I've enjoyed a lot of the derivatives. One of the few stories I have read, mostly because it's linked to my profession, is Under the Pyramids. And that's something he wrote for... Originally he ghost wrote it for Houdini, didn't he? And it was supposed to be like a autobiographical tale.
Yes, because the story, if I remember correctly, has a protagonist that is an escapologist travelling in Egypt, and this escapologist is challenged by a local man.
Well, it's even worse. They kidnap him, and they throw him down a...
He agrees at first. He says, yes, I accept your challenge. I can get out of anything. At which point, they take him out to the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And I still remember the line in it where he realises and thinks, wait a minute, there's something horribly wrong here.
Yeah.
But by that point, it's already way too late.
Yeah, that's it. He's kind of thrown down this shaft, isn't he? And he gets the shaft, so to speak.
Literally, yeah.
There's a lot of that kind of undercurrent of, I mean, God, just to call this xenophobic or post-colonial isn't doing that concept justice, really. Like, it's very, very obvious in this tale.
Oh, yes.
Because it starts out kind of like a travel guide, doesn't it? And just the sheer contempt for everything that isn't by the ancients, essentially.
Oh, yes, just for the way he describes the local people.
Yeah.
I mean, immediately, all the people he interacts with are untrustworthy.
Yeah. They're all shady.
They're all shady straight out of the gate. And you can't help but just think, wait, that's not period language. That's straight up racism.
It's pretty overt, yeah. Pretty overt superiority complex.
But then he is actually confronted by one of the ancient gods. It holds him in its hand. And by the time he makes it out, he's trying to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But it's heavily implied that it totally wasn't.
Yeah, he's rationalising this kind of crazy encounter with these things. There's some good moments in it, though, like the kind of midnight fisticuffs on top of the pyramid amongst the locals, and it kind of goes into these weird little side trips, these diversions into other stories from Egypt that are said to be told by the locals, like the Queen Nitocris, which is not a name, you would come across looking through a history of Egyptian royalty. The Lady of the Pyramid and the kind of the weird tales of mythology that surround, again, these figures who are somehow other. There's a dark queen who is some kind of figure of horror, even within the story of the figures of horror.
I tell you what, you just triggered my mind. Because we've just been talking about Egyptian horror stories about mummies and curses, but there was an exceptional tale which took a very different approach, which was by Algernon Blackwood, called By Water, which takes a more practical and realistic approach. The story starts with a young man about to get married who goes to visit a fortune teller because his fiancée believes in them, and the fortune teller tells him that he's going to drown in fresh water, which the man dismisses out of hand on the basis that he's going to Egypt, deep in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, and there's no fresh water around.
Yes.
So, ignoring the warning, he heads to Egypt, where everything starts off going well and promotion seems on the cards. He sets off to do one final duty on a public holiday, and on the way back, his horse throws him. So he gets up and looks around to realise he's now lost in the desert.
Yeah.
The challenge is to survive, because he realises that he can't be too far from the track, and if he wanders in the wrong direction, he's dead. The best thing he can do is stay where he is, and he takes the battering of the elements. And talk about primal fears, being stuck in the middle of nowhere and the certainty that remaining here will mean death. Exposure will kill you, dehydration, lack of food. This is a bad situation and you need to get out of it, and the best thing you can do is sit still. Yeah, so the story describes this assault from the elements, and the exposure completely drains his strength. When he hears the whoos of a rescue party and moves to look at them, but has no strength left, so he just flops down, and in doing so he starts to roll down this slope and accidentally lands face first into one of the secret watering holes the Bedouin use, and so he drowns, as was foretold. And as the reader, the creeping horror of being stuck in the middle of nowhere, followed by the inevitability of him landing in this puddle and thinking, oh no, the story's beautifully written.
Yeah, and you can see some of the kind of the themes in there as well, the idea of being lost in a desert, lost in a pyramid, trapped under a pyramid. You know, these are titles that kind of pop up again and again. This sense of dislocation brought about by the exotic, so to speak. And I just remembered one of the lines, one of the descriptors that Lovecraft uses in Under the Pyramids, and it was inquisitive and malignant Arabs.
Oh my lord.
Yeah, he actually says that.
Yeah, malignant.
Malignant, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, quite a choice of words.
Wow.
So, cosmic horror, you rightly note this journey from exoticism and romanticism, which of course is where, you know, a lot of the Gothic stuff and certainly the early mummy stories were romance things, where a mummy would be found and raised and it happens to be a beautiful woman, and it's this kind of male fantasy.
Oh, well, that's okay then.
Yeah, which is kind of, it's funny, isn't it? Because it starts off as this seemingly benign male fantasy where actually it turns both in the literature and the real world into something much scarier, much more quickly, as the self-conception of the Victorian man kind of changes as well, which is a pretty interesting parallel for me.
This is the thing I love about stories, generally, and in horror in particular.
Yeah.
As I said right at the beginning, we started telling stories to try and explain things around us. That tradition persists to this day.
Yeah.
We've been talking about Mary Shelley and H. Rider Haggard and Bram Stoker.
Yeah.
They are talking about their societal issues wrapped up in these monster stories. H.P. Lovecraft does the same thing. Stories are a way of us analysing and coming to terms with what's going on in our environment and with our history.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stories can be said to be very much of their time. Lovecraft, as we've just been saying, the inherent and overt racism in those stories.
Yeah.
It was of his time and the way he was thinking. Does that make it right? No. But as a view into our history and understanding what was being seen and challenging the issues of their day, it has value. Horror stories should be more than just being scary or thrilling or shocking. It should be an analysis of what's going on around us and giving voice to ideas that wouldn't necessarily be voiced, like feminism in the early 20th century or post-World War nihilism.
How does this feed into where the horror story kind of ends up and the development of cinema and stuff like that? Because I know that at the start of cinema, there was, again, and I will have a tendency to bring things back to Egypt because of my Egyptological background, but a lot of the early cinemas were evocative of the kind of tomb space. They were these dark, unlit spaces where you were transported into this liminal kind of place. And they were even decorated. A lot of the earliest cinemas were decorated with this kind of faux Egyptianized Art Deco kind of stuff. And a lot of the early silent films were about Egypt and mummies and things like that. Crazily enough, Birth of Cinema, Birth of Photography, hugely linked to those enterprises. How do we see these themes kind of developing through things like, you know, the vampire stories and Universal and Hammer and stuff like that?
Well, first of all, let's give some attention to an influential film. Have you ever heard of The Vampire, which was made in 1913?
Yes.
Yes, so that to me is the starting point for cinema horror. When new media forms are invented, it opens up possibilities to, 1, tell stories in a different way and with a different lens, and 2, to share stories out to the masses in ways that have never been done before. For example, if we go back to the Gutenberg press, up until that point we'd used oral traditions, sitting down, tell stories to each other, and then the printing press comes out and affordable books are being printed and literacy rates shoot up and a whole societal shifting culture happens. The Grimm Tales are printed, Castle of Otranto, Frankenstein, Dracula, all these books. At which point new technologies are developed and the cinema comes into existence and follows on the traditions of storytelling. 1913, we get the silent film The Vampire, which is about a man who is successful and respectable when suddenly this vivacious, strong woman appears and he is entranced. He forgets his wife and is drawn to this mysterious woman.
Yeah.
Having been tempted away, he loses all his human virtues. He turns to drink and ruin. Having sinned with the vampire, he loses his integrity as a human being. This film acts exactly like a fable. Be good or bad things will happen. Interestingly, this is also the invention of the cinematic femme fatale, the independent and dangerously sexual woman who will ensnare you if you're not careful, which is well known in 1920s noir detective pulp. When cinema begins, it's all very experimental, you know?
Yes.
The Lumiere brothers make a film of a train going through a station, which, so the story goes, when it was first played in a theatre, people allegedly jumped out the way.
Yeah.
I've heard that story isn't true. But at the time, the fascination with this new technology was very real. The film of the train going through a station does exist, and people did go to the cinema to see it, because they'd never seen anything like it before. And this is nicely homaged in Interview with the Vampire with Brad Pitt. The first time that his character gets to see the sun since he turned into a vampire is on the cinema screen.
Yes.
And he gets to sort of reconnect with his humanity. Anyway, back to the early days. People were experimenting so much at that time, and no one really knew what to do with it yet. So it made sense to make stories that had already been told. And the really forward-thinking people thought, well, one of the things we can do is we can trick the audience. We can make them think they're seeing something. The great example of this comes from Nosferatu in 1922. It has an image that's infamous, which is the sitting straight up from lying down.
Yeah.
Just coming forward through 90 degrees, and here I am standing up. Most recently homaged in What We Do in the Shadows, of course.
It was. I love that show.
That film is amazing as well. Taika Waititi is just amazing.
It's fantastic stuff. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually. I hadn't thought about that. The capacity to trick. And that was the development of a lot of kind of in-camera effects and stuff like that as well, wasn't it? So people were really experimental at the time.
Yes, and this is where we start to come into the universal horror cinematic universe with legends like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Universal at the time had invested lots of money into infrastructure, in cinemas and logistics, and so had to think about how to get that money back.
Yeah.
And they look at films that had gone before and wonder how they can improve upon it. And we start to see things be invented in these early days that we take for granted now. Nowadays we have CGI and makeup on colour film to convey meaning, but back in the 30s they didn't have those resources. It just wasn't possible. So they came up with a simple and effective way of creating this tension in the audience with the technology that they had. They invented the uplighting technique. If you look at any of the original black and white Universal horror films, all of the monsters are lit from underneath, which immediately makes you as a viewer think, oh my god, something's wrong. Because normally we're lit from above. The sun's in the sky, house lights, street lights. You're used to seeing people downlit.
Yeah.
The people who were working in cinema at the time needed an easy way to elicit that shock response from the audience to make them come to the cinemas, so they reversed the lighting direction and made this iconic effect. This led to a tradition in culture now where people around campfires famously put a torch under their face
Right.
when they're telling ghost stories.
That's genius. I'd never thought about that in that context.
Yes, so many of these things are ingrained now.
That's brilliant.
Now, England, not to be outdone, Hammer Films start to make horror films, but in a very different way to Universal, who are taking a very over-the-top theatrical style.
Yeah.
Whereas Hammer goes for a lurking, creeping tension. We see luminaries like Christopher Lee and Vincent Price start to come into the mix, and we get colour in our films, which leads to more innovation.
Yeah.
I think of that famous shot of Christopher Lee facing down, fangs bared. Hammer used the uplighting technique, but also made his eyes red and put dribbles of blood on the edge of his mouth. And seeing that contrast of red blood against his white skin, we get this terrifying vision. To bring us back to mummies for a second, just the evolution of mummies on film. So, when mummification in real life was discovered, or rediscovered, I should say, by the teams of archaeologists in Egypt, it was very strange and alien to them. Most people in England were buried or cremated, usually buried because if you were cremated, you were going to hell, so said the Catholic beliefs at the time.
Yeah.
So, buried, that's the way we do things. Then they discover these massive monuments to death, with sarcophagi inside, which, as they open up, there's this desiccation rather than rot. There's still skin on the body.
Yeah.
The body has been through a process which has preserved it in a way which hadn't been seen before. In the first mummy films, the mummy didn't have bandages around it.
No, that's right.
That's not what the Egyptians did.
Yeah.
They were bodies.
Yeah.
It's not until later that they used the bandages in the films.
Yeah.
It was a technique to create suspense, to scare people. Again, going back to these techniques of how to show the otherness and how to create horror in your audience. The uplighting trick works wonders, but the monster needs to have a face. Mummies, being desiccated corpses, don't necessarily have any facial features to work with.
Yeah.
So instead, they wrap a figure in bandages, so from a distance, the figure just looks odd rather than threatening. And then as they get closer, you realise the figure isn't walking right, and get the feeling something is wrong, and it's not until they're almost upon you and you can see through the bandages that you realise it's a monster. And this influences another famous movie monster, the zombie, because the thing that makes mummies, particularly the first movie Mummies, and zombies threatening is their inevitability.
Yeah.
It's not that they're quick, it's not that they're massively powerful, it's that they are unrelenting and inescapable. Zombies and mummies, you can run from them, they will find you, they will catch you. They are on a supernatural leash that leads straight to you. You can cross oceans, there is nowhere on this planet you can run from them.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I found so effective about the film. It follows, actually. It won't ever stop. You can go as far as you want to go. Eventually it will catch up with you, and it will probably be when you least expect it, when you're comfortable and you let your guard down.
Talking about mummies.
Yeah.
Let's get into an action film for a second. Let's get into the 1990s mummy film.
Yeah, one I know well, yeah.
Yes, I think we both do. It's such a gorgeous film.
Yeah.
It was promoted as an action-adventure film rather than horror, but the inevitability and tension brought from an Imhotep that is getting more and more powerful, it's definitely a horror film.
Yeah.
Which explores themes deeper than you would expect at first glance. Again, going back to this idea that horror should be something that explores more than just the shock and awe of spectacle. The equality of Evie as a female character, the equality between her and Rick,
Yep.
who appears very much like the traditional male lead, without question, from word go, is just like, yep, you're the one in charge. Okay. He knows his area of expertise, he knows her area of expertise, and they get on and develop together. It's the rest of the world that sees Evie as being an inferior woman, and actually as a protagonist, she absolutely kicks ass the entire way through that film.
That was the famous Jonathan Hyde line from that, isn't it? Only by a woman, what does a woman know? And of course he's famously undone by reading the book. And
No! You must not read from the book!
It's that taboo, isn't it? There's always a taboo. Someone breaks a rule, someone sins and has to be punished. And we even see that in that film, this idea of breaking taboo.
Absolutely, and this is something that is pervasive in horror. Certainly the modern era.
Yeah.
The whole concept of sin equals punishment. As you quite rightly say, everyone in that film that does wrong is taken out.
Yeah.
The only people that survive that film are the heroes, because they have done the right thing from word one. They haven't cheated, they haven't betrayed, they've stuck together and they've done their best. And they even reach out to help their enemies when asked for their help. Mm-hmm. When Imhotep is released and is hunting down the canopic jars and everyone's cowering, and obviously Evie and Rick have a better understanding of what's going on, whereas the other team, who are your typical action hero stars, who are very much guns blazing and brash, are now terrified and asking for help.
Yeah.
Our heroes try to help them. And they're rewarded with surviving the experience and winning the day.
Yeah.
And this sin equals punishment comes through with horror to the modern day, with the video nasties of the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Halloween. Seeing as this is a Halloween episode, why not mention Halloween?
Yeah.
Halloween is the ultimate example of sin equals punishment.
Yep.
The protagonist, Laurie, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, is a good girl. She does her homework, she does her chores, she does babysitting, she's dutiful, she's good, she's pure. Everyone else in that film drinks, smokes, has sex, and they are punished for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are killed, and Laurie is the only one to survive that experience. Yes, sin equals punishment is prevalent throughout horror.
Absolutely.
As well as Universal and Hammer, there was another company making horror films at that time that are very highly regarded called Amicus, who were known for anthology horror films. The idea was, rather than telling one long story with film, you could have a film with lots of little stories. This is a return to our oral tradition where everyone would have their own story to tell around the fire.
Right.
But with cinematic scope this time. Tales of the Crypt is the ultimate example
I
of...
love that show.
The TV show with the Crypt Keeper, we'll get into that, but Tales of the Crypt is originally a 1970s Amicus film.
Right.
Where a group of people are being led through a graveyard on a tour. They used Highgate Cemetery, I think. Mm-hmm. And the group stray from the path, and they find themselves in this room with this person stood in the middle. And they're all asking what's going on, and then you get these small vignette stories from each of those individual people, with them as either a lead or major character.
Yeah.
And these bite-sized nuggets, they were all gorgeous, but when they finish, you keep coming back to the hub. You keep coming back to the central crypt chamber. And so you're thinking, how are these people linked? What's going on here? It's only at the end when they say, okay, we finished all our stories now, we should go. And the crypt keeper turns around and says, go? What do you mean, go? You're not going anywhere. And they ask what he means, and he says, don't you remember? You all died. This is hell. And we have the big reveal. This is where we get to the television shows, which is where we get Tales of the Crypt Keeper, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits. The whole idea of having these small vignette stories with someone leading in from the beginning.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if you will, from the Twilight Zone, or we will take you on a journey from the inner minds to the outer limits.
Yeah.
And then you get Tales from the Crypt, where you get a comedic host which plays up the schlock and B-movie elements, seeing the value in horror stories and then framing them with comedy to make them more accessible, and getting younger people involved in horror was a masterstroke.
Yeah, absolutely wasn't it? Because I remember loving that genre as a kid, and I think I was, in a way, that horror comics were a gateway for me into that. And there were a few horror anthology comics at the time that I was really into, and shows like that. And that's kind of leads into the kind of stuff you're up to with the Stygian Chronicles.
Yes, so look at that. We've come round full circle like professionals. So as you can tell, I really love horror and stories. So it seemed to make sense to me as a sound designer looking for a creative project that was close to my heart, that I wanted to make, because usually I do post-production audio on films or master music, to have a project of my own. In this era of podcasts and audio coming back as an art form in and of itself, it just seemed natural to make a horror anthology, and the Stygian Chronicles is just that. It's little vignette stories. Each episode is only around 15 minutes long. It's something that you can easily listen to in a lunch break and escape.
Yeah.
Using sound design to tell the story with sound and give you an immersive experience you can enjoy. And no anthology is complete without a presenter to introduce and sign off. So I created a character called the Curator, who sounds like this, using friendly words, while the tone seems a bit suspect.
What sources do you draw on for when you're choosing your stories, for instance? Like, what's the criteria?
The whole idea came about because two of my friends are authors, and they had written these short stories. The first one is a friend of mine, Toby Norways, who wrote this short story which was published in an anthology horror collection. And he showed it to me and said, "You'll appreciate this." And as he read it through, I heard it. I heard the sound effects and all of the elements in the story linking together, and how the music would fit in. So I just asked him if I could make something out of it, and he said, yeah, of course. And a little while later, at a Christmas party, another friend of mine, Sophie Jonas Hill, read out the story she had, and again, I sat there listening. I just heard everything, and afterwards I asked if I could use it, and she said, yeah. So there were two stories to start from, and from there, I started rereading my books and seeing if there was any other material there. And then I started finding them, short stories and creepypastas, which I would read and go, I can hear the sounds in this. I could hear where these stories can be adapted into this audio form. And then I reach out to the authors. Most writers have a publisher or at least an email address that you can contact them. And then I ask permission and say, please, can I make this? They say yes or no. And if they say no, then I let it go. And if they say yes, I make them.
What have you got coming up that you're looking forward to then?
So we've got Muntjac as our first episode that releases on Halloween. The following week, we have The Changeling Cabinet, and the week after that is Ants by Chet Williamson, who wrote the story for Twilight Zone magazine. I don't really want to go any further. I feel like some mystery should remain. But we've got stories to take us all the way up to Christmas at the moment, which I am working very hard on. And then, if people listen and enjoy it, then we can move into the new year with more horror stories and really sort of take this series off and see where it goes.
Excellent. And will there be, this is for my own interest actually, will there be any kind of return to this style of Lovecraftian, weird curiosity, slightly exotic, archaeological, nutty Egyptian type tales that I'm so intrigued by, or anything like that in the future?
Absolutely. There's a story that I'm writing myself.
Cool.
Highly based in ritual and cosmic horror, but with a twist. I had this dream a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And I woke up thinking, that's a really cool spin on ancient gods and tenebrous rituals. So yes, that will be coming up too.
Well, as the Egyptians might say, dreams are the gods themselves communicating with you. Or the muses, if you're Greek. So I understand that you have something special for us today, and we're going to get an exclusive today, and you're going to give us an excerpt or a sample of what you guys have been up to, which I'm very excited to hear.
Yes, we have an extended excerpt for you. There are little teasers and trailers already up online, so for your show, we're giving you an excerpt from the third episode, Ants, which no one will have heard anything from yet.
I do love an exclusive. All right, let's get into Ants.
Inside, he opened up a bud and flopped on the sofa with a copy of Ms. Harriet's 2-year subscription was still going strong. He frowned at the article titles and picked up Sports Illustrated instead. He had barely opened the magazine when his nose started to itch. He looked down its broad length and noticed a small black dot at the point where his vision crossed. Thinking it might be a misplaced period on the page, he wiggled both his eyes and the magazine. But, instead of disappearing, the dot took a few tentative steps upward on the oily film that coated Ben's proboscis. "An ant!" he yelled, and smashed himself lustily on the nose. When he examined what stuck to his fingers, he found that it was indeed an ant. Or rather, crushed bits of ant head, ant thorax, and ant legs.
Yuck.
He said, and snapped the debris away.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing this with us. This is a fantastic project. I'm really super excited to see where it's going to go. I am backing the Patreon. Do you want to tell the listeners about where we can find you and how, if we're into this, we can help support what you're doing?
Yes, so if you like the sound of the Stygian Chronicles and want to hear more, you can find us on all the major podcasting sites, iTunes, Spotify, etc. And we are available on social media. Twitter is where we have all our up-to-date news. Find us with the tag @StygianCurator. And if you really, really like the sound of the Stygian Chronicles and would like to help us keep the lights on and make more radio plays, you can find us on Patreon @The Stygian Chronicles. If you subscribe now on our limited edition $1 tier, then on Halloween, you won't just get the first episode, Muntjac, but you will also get a premiere on the second episode, The Changeling Cabinet. That will be exclusive to you. Everyone else will have to wait a week before they'll be able to hear it, but you will get it same day.
I have signed up. I'm hoping lots of other people will do the same so that you guys can get this out there and make it the huge success it deserves to be. I hope you all at home have enjoyed our discussion of the history of horror and tying that in with the various beats that we like to cover on this show. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure talking about horror and narrative and all that good stuff with you. And I hope that your show is successful as it deserves to be, and that we'll see you again in next year, even maybe, with a whole batch of released horror stories behind you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Matt. Thank you, and best of luck.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's Halloween special episode, and be sure to like, subscribe, and share where you can. Sharing is caring, as always. We've actually got a couple of bonus episodes coming up, and I'm dipping into a couple of new formats. So I'm going to be doing some short form formats where I'm talking about various different things in the history of archaeology and Egyptology, and sometimes even some environmental stuff. So look out for those. You're going to be getting some bonus episodes. It's going to be going more than one monthly, and hopefully everything's going to gear up so that when I launch my Patreon, there'll be lots of lovely new content for you to get your hands on. Okay, I've been Dr. Paul Harrison. This has been the Profane Humanities Podcast. Thank you and good night.